150 years ago this day, as I mentioned, the Confederates raised their flag, stars and bars, at Fort Sumter, and the federal garrison left and surrendered. But I must also say that since these years, we've been differing in our opinions as to how this war started. Some say it began because of the issue of slavery, some states' rights. Some talked in terms of tariff and taxes. Of course, Confederate states did in fact claim the right to secede. But not one state claimed to be seceding for that right. In fact, I'd suggest that Confederates opposed states' rights. That is, the right of northern states not to support the institution of slavery. When South Carolina delegates adopted their secession, separation, declaration of the immediate causes which induce and justify the secession of South Carolina from the federal union, that's the whole title, they noted an increasing hostility on the part of the non-slave holding states to the institution of slavery, but protested that northern states had failed to, quote, I'm quoting, fulfill their constitutional obligations by interfering with the return of fugitive slaves to bondage. It is claimed that slavery, not states' rights, therefore birthed the Civil War. Without slavery in the United States, there would not have been war. Other seceding states, like Mississippi, echoed South Carolina's position. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. I'm quoting. So stated, therefore, on January 9th, 1861, its labor supplies the produce which constitutes by far the largest and most important positions and portions of the commerce of the earth. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. These are quotes from the secession ordinances of both South Carolina and of Mississippi. It certainly could not have been over the issue of tariffs and taxes, because secession was not caused by those. In fact, South folks, I guess you'd say Southern members of Congress, wrote the Tariff of 1857, under which the United States functioned. In fact, its rates were lower than any point since 1816. Now, although more worthwhile, I should say more while white families had no slaves, Southern whites, of course, including those who were not slave owners, still supported the institution of slavery. It was a way up the social ladder for their future. The South produced almost 75% of the United States exports that year. Slavery was still expanding and remained very profitable in 1860. What then produced the secession crisis in the United States that year? Answer: Abraham Lincoln, who was constitutionally elected the 16th President of the United States on November 6, 1860. How could Abraham Lincoln have become such a persona non grata to Southerners to set them to destroy the United States? Southerners were afraid of what Lincoln's election to the presidency meant for their future as a slave-holding people. Thus, the secession crisis began immediately after the election returns reached South Carolina. Long ago, the South had accepted the doctrine that secession was a valid constitutional remedy, always applicable when needed. It was now needed. The South had clearly committed themselves to the principle and doctrine of secession by 1858. Meanwhile, remember this: without constitutional authority, Lincoln had to confront issues and events which were in the process of destroying the very nation he'd been constitutionally elected to serve. Persistently, from his young years on, he'd persistently believed that slavery was unjust. In the 1850s, he believed that Northerners were obligated, however, to respect the Constitution of the United States and the compromises contained therein, protecting the institution, and that the national government had the authority to act, however, against slavery in the District of Columbia as well as in the national territories. As far back as 1837, he had criticized slavery as unwise and unjust. He was then a young member of the Illinois State Legislature, and he criticized the institution when abolitionism in Illinois was very weak and unpopular. It took genuine political courage, I may use the word guts, to take that position at that time. He certainly did not expect any political benefit out of his position, and Lincoln had said in 1860 it was then the same that it is now. During that Secession Crisis, in fact, a member of Congress from Missouri cited Lincoln's words from 1837. You see, the problem is that Lincoln took this statement and made it very strongly. He said, "This is a world of compensations, and he who would be no slave must consent to have no slave. Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it." Stephen Arnold Douglas attacks against Lincoln's slavery position in Illinois in the campaign for the Senate in 1858 and again the presidential campaign of 1860 stressed his slavery position as favoring Negro social equality between the white and the black races. And during the 1860 presidential campaign, Southerners who were not especially interested in reading Lincoln's speeches relied on what Stephen A. Douglas had said about Lincoln's positions on racial equality. The tyrannical North was about to elect an unknown man from the West, whose great sin was that he opposed the institution of slavery on moral grounds. Throughout the 1850s, there was an influential group of Southern political leaders who were meeting at Vice President John Charles Breckinridge's home in Washington City, right next door to Stephen A. Douglas's house. They had both built homes about the same time there. And they insisted that the only safeguard for slavery's future in such a circumstance would be to strike for independence, period. And as the Louisville Courier declared, the irrepressible conflict is now upon us. Already in 1858, Southern leadership began talking about unified separation from the United States and threatened secession if the Republicans, with Lincoln, captured the presidency. During the campaign, Lincoln did not want to credit any fear regarding secession in the country. Even in the fall of 1860, he believed secession talk in the South was bluster, was full of hot air. As a son of the South himself from Kentucky, Lincoln was confident that he understood the Southern mind, and he continually referred people, in order to understand his positions, to read his written speeches. He would say this over and over again because he sincerely believed that Southern people would find in his speeches his repeated promise that he would not touch the institution of slavery where it was located. In response to a letter in early August of 1860, Lincoln replied, "The people of the South have too much good sense and good temper to attempt the ruin of the government." Throughout the summer and fall of 1860, Lincoln was isolated from serious talk of secession across the South. As people talked about these issues on their porches and in their country stores, they turned Lincoln into a caricature. The talk made him out to be a black Republican, black meaning, of course, pro-Negro, pro-black, who had secretly aligned with Northern abolitionists who were ready to spread slave rebellions across the South. That's a caricature. And shortly before the October elections, while thumbing through a list of how Springfield residents proposed to vote, he concluded that 23 Springfield, Illinois ministers would not vote for him. How could such men with the Bible in their hands support candidates who were basically pro-slavery? This was a spiritually troubling thing for Lincoln. In this time of secession threats and election stresses, he said that he was going through, and this is a quote from him, a process of crystallization spiritually. Lincoln expressed a great sense of relief when victories in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana were announced at the beginning of the second week of October. He wrote William Seward in New York in October that it now looks as if the government is about to fall into our hands. And thus Lincoln maintained his silence all through October, although some of his supporters suggested that he write a public letter in those last days of the political campaign in which he should set forth his ideas and allay fears in the South. However, Lincoln never altered his strategy. He said nothing because he believed that anything he would say would be mistaken or misused. He called it, in fact, artificial. He strongly believed that if let alone, it would simply disappear. It was a sunny day on Election Day, November 6, 1860. Lincoln had one great fear. If he did not win the 35 electoral votes of the state of New York, he might not win a majority and the House of Representatives would select the next President of the United States. Shortly after midnight, the telegraph keys spelled out that New York State had fallen into the Lincoln column, and that he would indeed be the next President of the United States. Well, boys, your trouble's all over now. Lincoln greeted some newspapermen on the morning after the election. Of his own troubles, he told them, "Mine have just begun." He went home at 2 a.m., but he could not fall asleep. Overall, Lincoln had received 1,866,000 votes, more than any man who'd run for President of the United States, and over 500,000 more than John Charles Fremont, the first Republican presidential candidate in 1856. His strong northern sweep was more than enough to give him victory. In fact, Lincoln had received more than enough electoral votes to win the presidential office if the electoral votes for John Bell or John Breckinridge or Stephen Douglas had been united on one single candidate. Lincoln still would have been elected president in 1860. Lincoln's election was not due to any division among his political opponents, but due to the nature of the electoral system, which allows votes, as you know, concentrated in populous states to capture the presidential office. There was some sobering news in the middle of all of this. He was elected by only 39.9% of the popular vote. Therefore, Lincoln was the first president ever elected by a minority sectional electorate. However, the new president and Congress, elected in November, would not take office until March 4th, 1861. Even if the Republicans had controlled the national government during that winter of secession, they were helpless to stem the tide flowing toward secession. We forget that President James Buchanan was President of the United States, held all the constitutional power as an executive in his hands from November till March of 1861. I want you to remember that, because much of what I'm going to share now is based on the fact he had no control or power over what was happening. Lincoln has taken a lot of heat that he does not deserve for the winter session or secession movement. Lincoln began to build the new administration. He began to develop policies in those first days after the election without executive power. Now remember, he does not have presidential power, much like If you know your history, Franklin Roosevelt did not have any presidential power either from his election November of 32 till March of 33. That's the same thing here. Though gifted and capable, Lincoln somehow did not fully understand that secession, even war, was a possibility, while he remained in isolated Springfield. Lincoln, together with his Republican colleagues, were used to the persistent enmity between the North and South, and for over 30 years found enmity did not lead to war. The North encountered bluster before 1820, 1850, and when the Republican Party was organized, 1856. Therefore, they believed the strong Southern talk was mostly bluff. It had been said that Lincoln's greatest errors of political judgment was because he failed to grasp the growing secession spreading across the South. It was widely accepted that the Illinois State Journal's bellicose editorials reflected Lincoln's views, though Lincoln is remaining silent. A few days after the election, the Journal assured that the readers that the conservative majority of Southerners would be able to put down any batch of traitors bent on breaking up the Union. December 20, 1860. The very day that South Carolina seceded, the Journal warned that treason must and will be put down at all hazards. Another editorial declared that if civil war should come about, it would result in the total overthrow of slavery because slaves would escape to the North and might even rise against their masters. Lincoln believed that if he did nothing to provoke secession, the majority of the slave states would thus remain in the Union, and in fact, the Lower South would eventually return to the Union. However, he received continued pleas to say something. Well, Lincoln bristled at those requests because he said, they can read for themselves what I have said over and over in my speeches. I would not interfere with slavery where it exists. Why can't they read what I've said repeatedly? Southerners were not interested in reading what he had said. The day after the election, Senator Truman Smith of Connecticut tried to alert him regarding the growing secession crisis, and he wrote Lincoln a long letter. And Lincoln answered with these words, "It is with the most profound appreciation of your motive and highest respect for your judgment, too, that I feel constrained for the present at least to make no declaration for the public." It was all in print, all easy access. He could not fathom how any additional production of mine would meet a better fate. And as he declared, it would make me appear as if I repented for the crime of having been elected and was anxious to apologize and beg forgiveness. To so represent me would be the principal use made of any letter I might now thrust upon the public. But even the editor of the New York Times, Henry J. Raymond, audaciously offered Lincoln some sentences which he could offer to the general public to allay this fear. The president-elect responded. He said, quoting Jesus' words, "They seek a sign, and no sign shall be given them." These words were spoken to an evil and adulterous generation. He characterized his own generation as being possessed of party malice and not public good. Lincoln remained silent. Most Republicans remained silent, following a Fabian policy again of masterly inactivity. They would sit tight and hopefully it would all blow away. And so hate mail continued to arrive at the Lincoln home. Mrs. Lincoln was horrified by one picture that arrived of her husband with a noose around his neck. And of course, Lincoln was compared to the devil. He was threatened with death by hanging, gibbet, and stiletto. Very few signed these threats to him personally. Some signed it Southern Brotherhood or some such organization. The pressure for Lincoln remained so strong that finally he yielded partially. Senator Trumbull of Illinois had to give a message of victory, so to speak, November 30th, 1860 in Springfield, so Lincoln slipped him 2 paragraphs he could put in his speech to allay the fear. Didn't do anything. Nobody responded. Nobody republished Trumbull's speech, and Lincoln sat next to him on the platform when he gave it. The speech failed to have Lincoln's desired effect. But I'll tell you one thing. He complained that not one newspaperman used it to quiet public anxiety, and as he predicted in 1858 that the sectional conflict would not end until a crisis was reached and passed, when the crisis arrived, Lincoln just showed no disposition to back off. The tug has to come, he said, and better now than any time hereafter. Time is slipping away. And that he would not interfere with slavery, he said. He began to explore options after he became constitutionally the President of the United States on March 4th. Ours should be a government of fraternity, he told John Nicolay, his private secretary. The necessity of keeping the government together by force was an ugly point, he said. Yes, the very existence of a general and national government implies the legal power, right, and duty of maintaining his own integrity. Lincoln insisted that the right of a state to secede is not open or debatable question. It is the duty of the President to execute the laws and maintain the existing government. He cannot entertain any proposition for dissolution or dismemberment. After 6 months, he left Springfield for the first time, went north to Chicago to meet Hannibal Hamlin, his vice president, whom he had never met before. And during that same time, President James Buchanan believed that the Secession Crisis had been precipitated by Lincoln's election. And therefore, it was Lincoln's responsibility. But who had the power of the presidency but Buchanan for the next 4 months? Nice to say Lincoln's election was responsible, but that does nothing. Supposedly, a weak president, Buchanan clearly understood one thing that few Northerners did in November of '60, that the danger presented by secession was, in fact, a great and an immediate danger. Now, reading Buchanan's address, which he delivered to the Congress, which was taken over in those days, as you know, Thomas Jefferson was the first to send his State of the Union messages over and did not give them in person. And that was the case in Buchanan and then Lincoln's day, too. It wasn't until Woodrow Wilson delivered his own State of the Union that was changed. So the message was sent to the clerk to read. It must have been terribly boring to hear a clerk drone on and on, reading the whole State of the Union message, but that was the case. And Lincoln read what Buchanan had said. Well, Buchanan declared that secession was illegal. So Lincoln and Buchanan did not differ at that point. Lincoln held the very same position regarding secession, but one place he disagreed greatly, and that is Buchanan said he could not coerce a state back into the Union. He could not use force. And Lincoln said, yes, you can. As president, you have the power because it's rebellion. Reading Buchanan's State of the Message, Lincoln was appalled at the president's assessment of the national crisis. He said Lincoln said Buchanan was still a part of the problem. The Republicans, the Democrats now lost total support for Buchanan, began to organize their own positions to try and save the Union. And as a telegraph flashed news that Lincoln was elected the next president, South Carolina's legislature called a convention to secede, and on December 20, 1860, the Secession Convention, meeting in Charleston, voted unanimously to secede from the Union. Now everyone wondered what Lincoln's thoughts would be, because remember, he's saying nothing. Well, the Journal of Springfield declared South Carolina could not pull out of the Union without a fight. If she violates the laws, then comes the tug of war. And the editor, Lincoln's good friend Edward Baker, for whom they had named their second son, pronounced that the President of the United States has a plain duty to perform. Disunion by armed force is treason, and treason must and will be put down at all hazards. Now, I'm going to bring an element in here that's important. We've talked about Lincoln, we've talked about Buchanan. We've said nothing about Jefferson Davis. Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi and other secessionist leaders claimed only to be defending established institutions. Secession was legal, they said, and constitutional. Ours is not a revolution, Davis said. We're not engaged in a chaotic fight for the rights of man. Our struggles for inherited rights, especially the right to property and slaves, as the chances of settlement acceptable to Southern senators and congressmen receded, Davis became involved with a number of Southern congressmen in conversations, and they began to meet at his home on I Street in Washington, D.C. On January 5, 1861, a caucus of senators from the Southern states moving towards secession made a major decision to call a Southern convention that would meet at Montgomery, Alabama, to establish a confederacy for the South by February of 1861. They wanted concrete action before Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th. These Southern leaders wanted no part of a United States with Abraham Lincoln and his Republican Party controlling the executive branch of the United States government. Kentucky Senator Crittenden came up with a proposal, a compromise. Just take the Missouri Compromise line of 1820 and drive it all the way to the eastern border of California. Free above, slave below. Lincoln disagreed because it would extend the area of slavery across the nation. Lincoln continued to privately assure Southern friends, however, that his new administration would not interfere with slavery in the states or the District of Columbia or even in the territories. In fact, he would not interfere with the interstate slave trade. He would enforce the fugitive slave law. He would urge northern states to repeal some of their, or modify some of their personal liberty laws even. And during the secession winter, 4 states did take action regarding personal liberty laws. And this may come as a surprise to you, but Lincoln even supported nearly 2/5 of the Republicans in Congress who joined in passing a constitutional amendment to guarantee slavery in the states against federal interference from the government. And that's a major concession. In fact, as president, he was sent it to the states March 7, 61, and 3 states ratified it. That's all. But Lincoln wrote Stevens, his friend, who later became Vice President of the Confederacy, "You think slavery is right and ought to be extended, while we think it's wrong and ought to be restricted. That, I suppose, is the rub." But then, quietly, Lincoln sent word to General-in-Chief Winfield Scott through the congressman in Washington to prepare to retake any fort seized by the secessionist military. And when rumors reached Lincoln in Springfield that President Buchanan had ordered Major Robert Anderson, who commanded the U.S. garrison at Sumter, really also at Fort Moultrie in Charleston Harbor, to evacuate the fort, Lincoln angrily declared, and I'm quoting, "If that is true, they ought to hang him." Now, that's what Lincoln said of President Buchanan. If he would order Anderson to leave Fort Moultrie, and a few days later, that's exactly what Anderson did. December 26th, Anderson moved the garrison to Fort Sumter, located on an island. He felt it might preserve the peace because Fort Moultrie was in danger of being attacked much more easily. "If nothing but blood will prevent disunion," declared an Indiana newspaper in December, "let it flow." Throughout the North, some Republicans declared a war would be inevitably the consequence of secession. Now, hear me out. A very important statement. I give you the date for a reason. December 13, 1860. Secessionists declared that any hope of compromise no longer existed, if it ever had. The arguments exhausted all hope of relief in the Union through the agency of committees, congressional legislation, or constitutional amendments is extinguished. And we trust the South will not be deceived by appearances or pretenses of any guarantees. the honor, safety, and independence of the Southern people are to be found only in a Southern Confederacy. As early as December 2nd, 60, Jefferson Davis said, "No human power can save the Union. All the cotton states will go." South Carolina seceded. The officials demanded the surrender of Fort Sumter, and a party that believed slavery wrong had gone to Washington and demanded of Buchanan that the forts be surrendered, and Buchanan told them no. He would not surrender the forts to the Southerners of South Carolina. Meanwhile, in all of this, Lincoln is preparing his inaugural address. Can you imagine the strain of putting together an address during that time? He doesn't leave Springfield till February 11, 1861, and his inaugural special will go clear across the country to Washington, D.C., and will stop at various places. When it first stops in Indianapolis, it's his birth date, on February 12, 1861, and Lincoln at that point will say something I think is rather interesting. He asked the crowd if the government simply insists upon holding its own forts or retaking those forts that belong to it, would any of all these things be coercion? And they cheered him. When he got to Pennsylvania, he also spoke to them at Harrisburg and Philly. There will be no bloodshed unless it be forced upon the government. The government will not use force unless force is used against it. I shall endeavor to preserve the peace of this country so far as it can possibly be done, consistently with the maintenance of the institution of the country. He gave another speech at Harrisburg, which he delivered in the General Assembly, once much stronger. It is not with any pleasure that I contemplate the possibility that a necessity may arise in this country for the use of the military arm. And they applauded. When he arrived at Trenton, New Jersey, Lincoln spoke of the heroic sacrifices of the American Revolutionary soldiers in helping bring about a new nation. But he also intimated they might have to have another war to preserve the nation that the Revolutionary War soldiers had fought for. I shall do all that may be in my power to promote a peaceful settlement of all our difficulties, Lincoln said, 11 days before he became president. But it may be necessary to put the foot down firmly. The New York Tribune reporter interjected in his notes these words: "Here the audience broke out in cheers so loud and long that for some moments it was impossible to hear Mr. L's voice. Finally, able to continue, he said, 'And if I do my duty and do right, you will sustain me, will you not?' Loud cheers and cries of 'Yes, yes, we will.'" Lincoln's inaugural address was much on his mind, and he let Seward look at it, and my, there were some strong lines in that address. He will end it with a very strong word, and this was the last sentence as he wrote out his first inaugural. "With you and not with me is the solemn question of shall it be peace or sword?" That's how he ended it. And Seward said, "That will only further secession. You have to soften it." And he did with these words: "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, not of mine, is the momentous issue of civil war." Well, on a sunny day, March 4, 1861, he took the oath of office in front of 50,000 people. And he basically spoke in terms of the fact that Southern fears were not valid from this new administration. They were not going to endanger slave property. The central issue of the controversy, he said, one section of our country believes slavery is right, ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong, ought not to be extended. This is the only substantial dispute. These are his words. And then Stephen A. Douglas is standing right there while he's speaking, and he interjects, "Good, that's so. No coercion, no coercion. Good again." However, the heart of his inaugural was a lengthy repudiation of the right of secession and the affirmation of sovereignty and majority rule. Secessionists were not persuaded. In fact, they heard a clank of metal in that address. Buchanan said, "I cannot say what he means until I read his inaugural. I cannot understand the secret meaning of the document, which has been simply read in my hearing." Well, they got him back to the White House, and General Scott said, "Thank God we've got a government." For almost 2 months, an uneasy truce existed regarding two of the federal forts, Sumter, Pickens. The morning after his inauguration, Delivered on his desk was a telegram from Major Anderson at Sumter, who basically said the reinforcements to Sumter would be impossible now. It would take, he said, no less than 20,000 well-disciplined troops to relieve the fort within the time limit fixed by the growing depletion of provisions. And then he turned to Winfield Scott and said, "Can we relieve the fort?" And General Scott said, "Almost inevitably we cannot." He added it would require a fleet of war vessels transport together with an additional 25,000 men, that it would take 8 months to train. Impossible. At first overwhelmed by this advice, Lincoln soon became skeptical. Southern Unionists, Northern Conservatives, Secretary of State Seward encouraged him to withdraw the Sumter garrison. In fact, Seward did much more than that. He didn't only recommend policy, he sabotaged his president. He promised the Confederates commissioners that Sumter would be evacuated. He told the press, leaked it to the press, the same thing. But he never consulted his chief. And so Republicans who held that Sumter should be reinforced believed even if it began war, it should be. But on the same day, Lincoln polled his cabinet about it, and only one person said that they should supply the fort. On that same day, the Chicago Tribune came up with a suggestion. I quote, "Send a ship with provisions, but not with reinforcements. So to Sumter, and make no secret of its undertaking." The Tribune declared that this would place upon Mr. Jefferson Davis the responsibility of firing on a provision ship going to the relief of American citizens or suffering it to quickly accomplish the object of its mission. And by the third week of March, Lincoln thought he had found a formula just like the Tribune suggested. And then Gustavus V. Fox, the brother-in-law of Postmaster Blair, suggested the same thing. Send in relief, medicines, food, no ammunition, but announce to the officials that you're doing that. But Orville Browning, his friend, said, whatever policy Lincoln comes up with, war was still possible. He told Lincoln that it's very important that the traitors shall be the aggressors. The first attempt that's made to furnish supplies or reinforcements to Sumter will induce aggression by South Carolina, and then the government will stand justified before the entire country in repelling that aggression. By mid-April, Sumter could not be preserved. By the end of March, Lincoln had to make a decision. He ordered a garrison ready to supply munitions and food. No munitions, I should say, but medicines and food. Well, President Lincoln was willing to accept war rather than accept the dissolution of the government, the Federal Union, which Jefferson Davis said no longer existed. Now, I want you to note something. On February 15, 1861, the Provisional Congress of the Confederacy said that Fort Sumter and the other southern forts should be taken by negotiation or by force, if necessary. On April 9th, the Confederate cabinet made the critical decision to order Fort Sumter attacked before the relief expedition arrived. Davis Secretary of State Robert Toombs opposed the decision of the cabinet and declared, I quote him, "It will lose us every friend at the North," and he added, "You will wantonly strike a hornet's nest. Legions now quiet will swarm out and sting us to death. It's unnecessary. It puts us in the wrong. It is fatal." On April 10th, P.G.T. Beauregard, General in Command, received orders from the Confederate government in Montgomery to demand the evacuation of the fort. April 12th, that's exactly what will happen. By April, Confederate leaders believed that the Upper South would in fact join them if they attacked Sumter. And secessionists from Virginia arrived in Charleston and said that they would join the Republic of South Carolina if and when they should strike a blow. At 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, a shot arched across the sky in the middle of the night and crashed in the parade ground at Fort Sumter. And for the next 34 hours, 50 Confederate guns and mortars fired 4,000 rounds. to Sumter's 1,000. April 14th, with Fort Sumter in flames, they put the fire out, but it recaught, that's a word used in the paper at the time, 3 different times. Major Anderson took down the Stars and Stripes, and the Confederates raised the Stars and Bars. Anderson left with his flag. He left with 5 slightly wounded men and their personal sidearms, and got aboard the steamer Isabel for New York. The Civil War had begun. And with the fort surrender, President Lincoln declared that a state of insurrection existed in the seceded states. On April 15th, he called for 75,000 military volunteers to suppress the rebellion, ordered the expansion of the regular army, the regular navy, proclaimed a blockade to 2 coasts in 2 different proclamations. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus between Washington and Philadelphia. And with Congress adjourned, he called them again to assemble on July 4th, 1861. Meanwhile, 4 more slave states went out. They said that's coercion. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas brought the number of the Confederate states to 11. During the next months, Lincoln explained his actions to 2 friends. You and I both anticipated the cause of the country would be advanced by making the attempt to provision Fort Sumter, even if it should fall. And it is no small consolation now to feel that our anticipation is justified by the result. After Fort's surrender, Lincoln wrote to a friend, the plan succeeded. They attacked Sumter, and it fell, and thus did more service than it otherwise could. One bright spot in the middle of all of this, in mid-April, Lincoln received a request from the small republic of San Marino in the mountains around Italy. The request was the 2 republics of the United States and San Marino joined together in an alliance. But they also salved it with a nice little plum. They would make him a citizen of San Marino. And would you believe Lincoln accepted the citizenship of San Marino? But this is what he wrote. He told them that the trial through which the Republic is now passing is one of deep import. It involves the question of whether a representative republic extending and aggrandized so much as to be safe against foreign enemies can save itself from the dangers of domestic faction. Then Lincoln added, I have faith in a good result, which later became the center of Gettysburg Address. I'm thankful to Dr. David Freeman, my colleague in the Department of History, bringing this to my attention. Lincoln was now in charge of the Northern response to secession. He believed that Southerners commenced by an insidious debauching of the public mind. In fact, they invited an egregious or ingenious sophism, an invalid argument. With rebellion thus sugar-coated, they've been drugging the public mind of their sections for more than 30 years. Now, in the very last speech he gave, and whenever I'm at the White House, those who've been with me know I like to do this. I stand out in front of the north portico, and I look up to the center window above the entrance to the White House on the north side. There's a window there. It had a Jefferson equipped sash where you push the lower sash up all the way, and it makes a whole entrance or opening to the White House. That's where Lincoln spoke from, at that window. And on April 11, 1865, he said these words, we all agree that the seceded states, so-called, are out of their proper practice relation with the Union, and that the sole object of the government, civil and military, in regard to those states is to again get them into that proper practical relation. I believe it is not only possible, but in fact easier to do this, without deciding or even considering whether these states have even been out of the Union, than with it. That is the same speech in which Lincoln announced that he believed that the blacks who had fought in the Civil War to the tune of about 180,000 plus, along with literate blacks, should have the right of citizenship in the United States. In that audience was a 26-year-old young man actor who said, that would be the last speech he would ever make. That was John Wilkes Booth. And it was Lincoln's last public address. Now, let me say some things in conclusion and sum up with you what I have done. For over 30 years, Southerners in the Deep South slave states talked about secession as a way to protect their way of life and their Southern civilization. After 1858, Southern leadership spoke openly about secession in case a Republican candidate became president of the United States. This open threat was discussed publicly long before Lincoln ever became a candidate for president in May of 1860. But his nomination and his election to the presidential office in November caused Southern leadership to plan the establishment of a new confederacy, a new nation. In fact, after the Confederates organized their nation, their provisional Congress, again, remember, resolved back February 1561 to seize Southern forts as early as practicable, either by negotiation or force. And again, on February 22, they charged the Confederate government for the forts still held by the United States. Although elected, remember, Lincoln is not yet President of the United States. But on April 9th, Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his cabinet ordered Fort Sumter attacked before the relief expedition arrived. And the next day, General Beauregard received the order to attack, and thus on April 12th at 4:30 a.m., the Confederates attacked Fort Sumter, and the war began. In the middle of all of this Confederate activity, President Abraham Lincoln labored to make sure that if the war came, the Confederates would be responsible for its beginning. Abraham Lincoln's election as the 16th President of the United States became the occasion then, as well as the excuse, to destroy the existing United States by Southern pro-slavery leaders in the Deep South. And the bloodiest war in American history began on American soil for the next 4 years, 1861 to 65. And as Lincoln proclaimed in the middle of this tragic war that there was a redeeming purpose for all of the bloodshed being spilt on American soil, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth.